A river crossing. That's all it was, a shallow bend in the Thames where cattle could be driven across without drowning. No walls, no towers, no university, just oxen, mud, and a track through the reeds. From that crossing, one of the most consequential cities in human history would slowly grow. A place where kings came to hide, where scholars came to argue, and where ideas were born that would outlast empires. This is the complete history of Oxford. To tell it, we use artificial intelligence to reconstruct the city as it once was. Some images won't be perfect, but every fact behind them has been carefully verified. Stay until the end. The story gets stranger than you'd expect. Oxford doesn't begin with a great king, it begins with a problem. Around the 8th century, Saxon settlers needed a crossing for their livestock on the Thames. Near the confluence with the river Cherwell, the water spreads into shallow channels. They called it Oxenford, the ford of the Oxen. The first permanent mark on this place comes from a woman. A Saxon noblewoman chose this spot to found a small priory rather than accept the king who wanted to marry her. She's known as Frideswyde, and her church was built on the ground where Christ Church Cathedral stands today. Oxford sat on the fault line between Saxon Wessex and the Danish Danelaw. Alfred the Great understood its value. He fortified it as part of his network of defended towns designed to stop Viking movement. In 912, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle names Oxford for the first time. A cattle crossing had become a strategic asset. In 1002, a king's fear changed Oxford forever. The English king ordered the killing of all Danes living in his territory on a single November day. In Oxford, Danes fled to the Church of Frideswyde seeking sanctuary. The townspeople barred the doors and set the building on fire. In 2008, excavations at St. John's College unearthed 37 skeletons, young men stabbed from behind, some partially burned. Archaeologists confirmed they were Scandinavian. The bones had been there for 1,000 years. Then came the Normans. In 1071, a knight built a castle on the western edge of Oxford. The message was clear and built in stone. In 1142, an empress besieged inside the castle for 3 months, slipped out on a December night with 3 knights, crossed the frozen Thames dressed in white, and walked 6 miles through enemy lines to safety. The castle surrendered the next morning. She was gone. In 1167, a quarrel between a king and the Church of France changed Oxford permanently. Henry II banned English students from attending the University of Paris. Oxford absorbed them. The growth was fast and chaotic. Masters rented rooms. Lectures happened wherever space could be found. By around 1190, the first recorded overseas student had arrived. Oxford was already international. Then in 1209, a scholar killed a woman in the town. The townspeople hanged 2 of his innocent colleagues in revenge. In protest, a group of masters and students left Oxford entirely and travelled northeast to a small town on the River Cam. What they built there became the University of Cambridge. The exiled scholars eventually returned. By 1214, Oxford had a chancellor. By 1249, the first of its colleges had been founded. A diplomatic argument between 2 kings had, almost by accident, created the most influential educational institution in the English-speaking world. The university grew fast, the city grew to resent it, students were exempt from local laws, immune from city courts, and entitled to privileges ordinary residents could never claim. They drove up rents. They were loud, frequently drunk, and legally untouchable. Riots broke out repeatedly across the century. Then came February 1355. 2 students at a tavern near the centre of Oxford complained their wine was bad. The landlord argued back. One student threw the drink in his face. Within hours, both sides had armed themselves. Over 3 days, gangs from the surrounding countryside poured into the city. Scholars were hunted through the streets. Around 63 students and approximately 20 townspeople were killed. The king sided with the university. The city's mayor was ordered to attend an annual mass of penance and pay a fine for every dead scholar. That ritual continued for 470 years, finally abolished in 1825. A complaint about wine, 3 days of killing, nearly 5 centuries of enforced atonement. 2 Oxford scholars quietly laid foundations that would take centuries to detonate. The first, known as the Wonderful Doctor, returned to Oxford around 1247 and threw himself into subjects his church considered dangerous. He was the first person in Europe to document a working formula for gunpowder. He described spectacles and flying machines. His own order eventually locked him up for heresy. He believed knowledge could only come from experiment and observation. In the 13th century, that was a radical act. A century later, a theologian and fellow of Merton College concluded that the Bible, not the Pope, was the ultimate authority for Christians. He oversaw the first complete translation of the Bible into English, was driven from Oxford, and inspired the reformers who would launch the Protestant Reformation. More than 40 years after his death, the church dug up his body and burned it. Oxford does not just form great minds, sometimes it produces minds the world is not ready for. In October 1642, after a drawn battle that left both sides uncertain, Charles I chose Oxford as his base. The rivers made it defensible. The university was loyal. The colleges were large enough to house a court. For 4 years, Oxford was the royalist capital of England. The king lived in Christ Church. The Queen held court at Merton. Parliament met in the college halls. A royal mint struck coins in the university buildings. Citizens were ordered to dig defensive earthworks with their own shovels, without pay. Disease spread. Food grew scarce. By spring 1646, the royalist cause was collapsing. On the 27th of April, Charles slipped out of Oxford, disguised as a servant, and rode north to surrender. The garrison held 2 more months before handing the city over. Oxford was left to calculate the cost of 4 years of loyalty to a losing king. Oxford rebuilt. In 1669, a young architect completed the first major building of his career, a ceremonial hall inspired by ancient Rome rather than Oxford's Gothic tradition. Christopher Wren had studied at Wadham College. The Sheldonian Theatre still stands. The decades that followed produced John Locke, whose ideas about liberty and consent shaped every democratic constitution that followed. Edmund Halley predicted the return of the comet that bears his name. But the most vivid figure of this era arrived from Dublin in 1874. A young Irishman walked through the gates of Magdalen College on a scholarship for classics, decorated his rooms with peacock feathers and blue china, won the university's most prestigious poetry prize, and graduated with first-class honours. He later wrote that the 2 great turning points of his life were when his father sent him to Oxford and when society sent him to prison. Oxford gave him the language and the confidence. English society took the rest. While the university produced philosophers and poets, the eastern edge of Oxford was becoming something else entirely. In 1912, a former racing cyclist from Cowley, who had taught himself mechanics, registered a company to build a car ordinary people could afford. He took over a disused military college and converted it into a factory. The first car rolled off the line in March 1913. He called it the Morris Oxford. By 1914, the factory had switched to munitions. Morris returned to cars in 1919. By 1924, his company had overtaken Ford to become Britain's largest car manufacturer. By 1936, the Cowley plant produced 100,000 cars a year, roughly a third of Britain's total output. When the Second War came, the line switched again. Tiger Moth aircraft, parachutes, Spitfire repairs. The city of dreaming Spires had become, without quite planning to, one of the most important industrial cities in Britain. Every Tuesday morning through the 1930s and 1940s, a small group of writers gathered in the back room of a pub on St Giles Street. They read their unfinished manuscripts aloud to each other. One was working on a story about a hobbit, another was writing about a lion and a wardrobe. The group called themselves the Inklings. The pub was the Eagle and Child. Between those walls, the drafts of 2 of the most widely read works of the 20th century first met human ears. Oxford had been doing this for centuries, Roger Bacon imagining flying machines, John Wycliffe translating a banned Bible, Oscar Wilde turning scholarship into performance, a king hiding in Christ Church, a mechanic building an empire from a disused college, a professor inventing a world in a pub. The city that began as a cattle crossing now exports its ideas to every corner of the planet. Somewhere in Oxford, right now, someone is probably working on something the rest of us aren't ready for yet. That's what Oxford does, it always has.